Good evening, everyone. Welcome to JWA's Book Talks. I'm Judith Rosenbaum of the Jewish Women's Archive. I am so thrilled to be back with you tonight for the first session of our fall book talk series. I hope you had a wonderful summer. I really missed our regular Thursday night gatherings with all of you. I'm very glad that JWA can continue to offer this opportunity for connection and for learning together. Please, as always, say hello in the chat box. Make sure to chat to everyone. We love to know who's in the room with us and where you're coming in from. Also, the chat box is where you can add your questions throughout the program, and I will bring them into our conversation later. A few words about JWA for anyone who is joining us fresh and new. We are a digital archive that expands and transforms the way that we understand history and Jewish culture by documenting and sharing Jewish women's stories. We also pay special attention to how gender functions in the past and present, and we believe that uncovering a more diverse and nuanced story will help us create a better world. So thank you for being our partners in that work. The book talks are just one piece of JWA's work, and I hope that you will check out our wonderful website, jwa.org, where our archive lives, to explore the full range of projects and resources that we offer. A very quick logistical note, if you would like captioning, you can click the button that should be at the bottom of your screen that says CC or Show Captions, and that should turn on the captions for you. Okay, I am delighted to introduce our author for this evening. Susan Rubin Suleiman was born in Budapest and emigrated to the US as a child with her parents. She graduated from Barnard College and obtained her PhD at Harvard, where she went on to a long and distinguished career as a professor of French and comparative literature. Suleiman has published more than a dozen books, several of which I have actually on the shelves behind me, and more than 100 articles in international journals, as well as book reviews in the New York Times, the Boston Globe, Moment Magazine, many other newspapers and magazines, as well as an encyclopedia entry in JWA's own encyclopedia. She's the author of also some autobiographical works, including the acclaimed memoir, Budapest Diary, In Search of the Mother Book, and her new memoir, which we'll be discussing tonight, Daughter of History, Traces of an Immigrant Girlhood, which was published this past May. Susan has won many honors, including fellowships from the Guggenheim Foundation, the Rockefeller Foundation, the Radcliffe Institute, and the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum. In 1990, she received the Radcliffe Medal for Distinguished Achievement, and in 1992, she was decorated by the French government as an officer of the Order of Academic Palms, the Palmes Académiques. In April 2018, she was awarded France's highest honor, the Légion d'honneur. She lives in Chevy Chase, Maryland, although tonight she's coming to us from Martha's Vineyard. Welcome, Susan. So happy to have you with us tonight.
Thank you very much. I'm very pleased to be here.
So before you, I know you're going to read a little bit of an excerpt for us to give a taste to the folks who haven't had a chance to read your book yet, though I hope people will read your book. Tell us a little bit about how you came to this particular project.
Well, I had been thinking for a number of years, actually, about writing a sequel to my other memoir, Budapest Diary, which appeared, gosh, in the late 90s. And that was really about my returning to Budapest. I had left as a child, and then I had just closed the door behind me and never thought I would be going back when I left. I thought it was forever. But then when my children were about 14 and 7, and my mother was ill, my mother had fallen ill, I just had this sudden illumination that I had to go back to Budapest and show my children the city, where I had been a child. And so I wrote Budapest Diary, which was about returning to Budapest. And in fact, then the Berlin Wall fell down. We went back when Budapest was still communist, but then the Berlin Wall fell down and everything opened up, and I spent 6 months there later, and that's what that book was about. But then I realized, I really wanted to write more about my childhood in Budapest, my early childhood, which dates to the last year of World War II, and some of my earliest memories are from there. And then and then about coming to America, what it meant to become an American. But this project was in the back of my mind for a long time, for several years. And I sort of had an idea how I wanted to do it, but you have so many other obligations. And then COVID hit in 2020, as you remember. And I just, I, like everybody else, I found myself totally, I had my younger son and grandchildren who lived not far away, but still we couldn't really spend any time together or anything. So I just began to write, and I realized the only place to go was inward. Uh,
Mm,
and then this project, at first I wrote like a journal. I just wanted to see what was going on, what was in the newspaper, what was happening, how many people had died, whatever. And then it became that I began to write about photographs around my house. And slowly that whole project of that I had been thinking about for all these years came back, and I wrote one chapter and then another chapter, and there you are. But I have to say, like, this was a book I wrote very quickly.
mm.
At least the first draft, I wrote it within a year, in less than a year.
Wow.
Then, of course, as you know, writing is mainly rewriting, so I rewrote it. I spent another year rewriting, but that's how it happened.
Well, it's one of the, I think one of the silver linings of COVID is the kinds of creative projects that some of us didn't have time for during our usual busy, frenetic lives, and we're forced to take a break and shift gears a little bit. And some beautiful things have emerged. So we can be grateful for that, I guess.
Yeah,
Why
no,
don't we
that's yeah. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, why don't you share an excerpt with us? And while you do that, because I know you're going to read a piece that talks about one of the photographs, and photographs play a big role in this book. I'm going to actually show on the screen the photograph that you're going to be talking about, so people can have a visual.
Well, it's the first photo. It's the first photo in the book, and so yes, it is quite important. And also, objects play a big role in my book. And the prologue is titled "The Silver Pin," and if you look carefully, you will see it on my mother's dress. So it's called "The Silver Pin." She had pinned it on the collar of her black dress for the formal photo, a silver flower, long and slender, the sculpted leaf spreading on both sides of the stylized petals, with two symmetrically placed pearls in the middle. Today, it has little or no commercial value. The pearls are slightly yellowed, and if one looks closely, one sees many imperfections on their surface. But back then in Budapest, whenever I saw my mother wearing it, I thought of it as a precious thing. My father gave it to her shortly before the photo session, a sign of prosperity and survival, and of love, too, for despite their being profoundly mismatched, as I came to think later, a passionate bond existed between them. They had married for love against his father's wishes, had survived the war with their only child, and soon they would be seeking a new life far away from the world they knew. Even in my adolescent rages against them, I had to admit they did not lack courage or pluck. That last photo session in Budapest took place in the spring of 1949, a few months before we left Hungary. Mother had curled my hair for the occasion in long corkscrew curls that hung down to my shoulders, and she too had been to the hairdresser. I can imagine her thinking, capture this moment before we turn our back on it. I was 9 years old. 5 years earlier, we had been hiding from the Nazis in a house in Buda with false papers, false names, but that too was behind us now. Strangely, I don't remember her ever wearing the pin after we came to America. Was this modest relic of post-war Budapest unworthy in her eyes? Or was it associated with a country and a city she had no desire to remember? Some immigrants retain their ties to the old country. My uncle Lutzi, mother's brother, returned to Budapest every summer for more than 30 years, right up to his death. Communism or no, the Jerbo pastry shop on Vörös Marty Square still served the best sour cherry strudel, and you could dine outdoors on chicken paprikash at the Duna Corso restaurant every night, late into the night. Not to mention music and theater, the best in the world, he assured me whenever I saw him. My mother had no truck with such nostalgia. She never went back to Budapest, and she reminisced about her youth in that great European capital only if I pushed her hard. The Gellert Baths, I went there often when I was courting, or The Fisherman's Bastion on Castle Hill has beautiful views of the city. Generally, she sought advancement and novelty, not memories. So my mother played a big role in the book. And do I have time to read a short paragraph more, or
Sure.
should I
Yes,
stop?
absolutely.
So, my mother plays a big role, my father too, family. But one of the other things is food and its relationship to place. The foods associated with Budapest, but also with America. And I just thought I would read just my first introduction to American food, or drink, which was not the most auspicious. So this was on our way. We had spent time in Vienna, 8 months in Vienna, and we were on our way to Paris and then to Haiti, of all places. And we made a stop in Munich at the airport to change planes. And so here's this little paragraph. I recall that someone met us after the first flight, and we sat with him in a cafeteria at the airport. I think Uncle Nick had sent him. In any case, he was from America. I don't recall what language we spoke with him, but it could not have been English. Probably it was German or maybe even Hungarian. The grown-ups order coffee, and for me, he orders a drink that he says I absolutely must try. This is the most popular drink in America. You will love it. The drink is bubbly and black and comes in an oddly shaped bottle that the waiter empties into a tall glass he hands to me with a straw. Coca-Cola, the man says with a broad smile. Taste it, it's delicious. I take a sip. It's sweet yet medicinal, foul tasting. I have a hard time not spitting it out. Well, how do you like it? The man asks. I cannot bring myself to reply. You have to get used to it, he says. You'll see, you'll love it. I wonder whether I have failed an important test. Was this a foretaste of what awaits me once we finally reach America? If I have to learn to love this concoction that Americans are crazy about, I will never become a real American. I have been an American now for close to 7 decades, but confess that I have never learned to love Coke or Pepsi. I should say that the next piece of American cuisine that I encountered about a year later was Rice Krispies. And I did love Rice Krispies. I was told by the lady who introduced me, you will love this. And I did. So not everything was.
So that could reassure you
Anyway,
that there might be a place for you in America.
yes, that did reassure me. Yes,
And that theme
absolutely.
of trying to assimilate is a big theme in your book, but you also in that piece reference language and not even being sure what language you were speaking at the time. And I was so struck by the way, I mean, first of all, how many languages you had to learn along the way, but there's a place where you talk about language as a kind of home. But your native language is Hungarian. You've primarily written in English, but also in French since you study French literature. How do you relate to these various languages, and in which do you feel most at home or most yourself?
That's really a good question, Judith. As we know, or there's a paradox, but I'm not the only one who has it. I think it's a paradox that many immigrant children have, which is they have a mother tongue, a mother tongue. That's a very strong word for the native language, the language they were born into. They have a mother tongue, but it's not the tongue, the language that they speak the best. Because if they left their home country early. I left when I was 10. So I had done 4 years of school, but then, for a long time, I didn't know more Hungarian than a 10-year-old child. And then when I started going back, I now can speak a fairly advanced form of Hungarian. But okay, so the mother tongue exists, but it's not your best language. So I kind of play around with that notion of there's a stepmother tongue and a faux mother tongue. I think I can't remember which one I say is French and which one English, because I learned French before I learned English. And so French became, and later on, of course, as you said, I became a professor of French literature. So I really got back into French. So maybe French is my stepmother tongue, or maybe English is my step. But no, I think French is my stepmother tongue, and English is my faux mother tongue, because it's the one I do feel the most comfortable in. But this kind of suggests that identity is linked to places and to languages, and one can be between languages or have more than one. And I think in a way that's one of the things I write about in the book, is that you can have, or that I learned in a way, is that you can have more than one home, you can have more than one language that you feel at home in, and you can have more than one identity if you can manage it, but it's complicated. I mean, it's not, yeah.
Right. Well, identity is complicated, right? It's not static, and it's not one thing. And even the idea, I mean, I think often people think there's an idea of what it is to be an American, but of course, Americans are all kinds of things, and many are immigrants who bring all, different parts of cultural fusion together. I'm interested also in one of the things you write about in the book is about kind of gaps in your memory and how you filled in some of the blanks. And also you write about what you call unforgetting Hungary, and how you had kind of blocked out so much of your early experience. And you already mentioned that you returned later in life with your sons, and kind of that brought you to your first memoir, and actually like had an impact on your career because you turn more towards history. But I'm curious also if that process of unforgetting and exploring the gaps in your memory is also related to language. Like are there certain memories that you have in certain languages, or certain access to certain memories that you can have when you enter into a particular language?
Obviously language is words. There are certain words that will trigger, something. For example, I think I even use certain words like the Hungarian word for the noodles that come with chicken paprikash. It's nokerli. So nokerli brings to mind, my grandmother, who did all the cooking in our house. She lived with us until I was 9 years old in Budapest. So yes, language is linked to memory, uh, but I think this notion of unforgetting is that you really picked up on, yeah, but it's also linked, I unforgetting. So why don't I use the word remembering, which is really what in a way it is? I think it's because unforgetting implies a kind of process. First you forget, and then you unforget. So why do you forget? Well, I think again, it's a very common experience for immigrant children, is that they in order to to cope, or really to survive the kind of being yanked out of one place to another place and then to another place, is that you kind of forget a lot. You forget the thing that happened yesterday, because now we're moving on to a different place. And in a way it's a good thing, because it allows you to cope. It's a coping mechanism. It's a sign of, everywhere you turn now, you read about resilience, right? I mean, children should have resilience. And yes, it's a good thing to have resilience. But one of the things about resilience is, in order to be able to move ahead, which is what resilience is, you can sort of bracket the unpleasant things and go on and move ahead. You have to sort of shove a lot of stuff into the background. You have to forget many things. And so the process of unforgetting is a real, and it occurred when I first went back to Budapest with my kids in 1984. That was like the moment when I visited the house where I lived, and the apartment, and I took them up there, and we knocked on the door. There were people living there, and they were very nice. They let us in. But that whole thing, and of course, it's also true that for people like me, since I deal so much with words, the unforgetting was immediately linked to writing. So, I began to write my first memories, which date back to 1944, to the Holocaust, really. But so that was a long-winded way to answer your question. But I think unforgetting is a very interesting sort of
Yeah,
process.
I was very taken with that term, because I like the way that it holds space still for the forgetting. The unforgetting doesn't erase that it was previously forgotten, as opposed to remembering, where it you feel like it papers over the forgetting process, but you're in some ways what you're doing in this book
That's
is holding space for that forgetting, even as you're
yeah,
filling it back in.
yeah.
Um,
That's
go ahead. Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
no. I agree with you. Thank you.
So you said that you talk about how you organize the book around objects and photos and things that you found in your house. As you said, some of that may have emerged by just into the fact that you were in lockdown as you were writing, so you had to write from the things that were around. But also these are obviously very meaningful objects, and in fact, you talk about them in one place as being like relics. Do you think of these objects, these photographs and sort of heirlooms from your childhood as being sacred in some way?
I'm sorry, I didn't catch your
Sacred?
one. No, I don't think they're sacred. Although it's a good point that you make, because relics, the notion of a relic in religion, I mean, it's really more of a Christian idea, actually, I think. But maybe also, I don't know whether in Judaism we speak of relics. I guess,
Yeah, I don't think
in,
so,
I know
really.
that their relics are associated, for example, with a saint. So, you have like a piece of hair from Saint so and so, or a toe bone, or something, some remnant. A
Mhm.
relic is like a remnant associated with a saint. So, and even with Christ, I think there are certain places where they say, well, this is a piece of the true cross, or something like
Mhm.
that. So a relic has a kind of sacred sense in a religious sense, especially for Christians. But I call these ordinary relics, or
Mm.
everyday relics. So we all have things that remain with us, and that are the point about a relic is that, for example, it was a part of the saint's body or something, so that's what makes it sacred. But ordinary relics, it's not linked to religion. It is more linked to the past, to history, and to memory, uh, and sometimes to family, because the pin that I read about is very much linked to my mother.
Mhm.
So sorry. So so these relics are everyday objects. I don't know what's happening to me. I seem to be needing water.
Well, it is very hot.
Sorry. Go ahead, Judy.
Um, so speaking of your mother, you write a fair amount in the book about your relationship with your mother, which was a difficult relationship. But it's also clear in the book, I thought that your treatment of her was quite sympathetic, in that you're trying to understand decisions that she made and kind of uh, give her the benefit of the doubt. Did you feel like writing this book shifted something in your understanding of your mother and your relationship with her? I mean, I I often think one of the things that I have learned that I was unprepared for when my mother died, I thought that your relationship with someone ends when they die. And I had no idea that is completely untrue. Your relationship goes on, it continues to grow, it continues to change. You can still fight with a person even when they're not there. So I'm curious whether you felt like, even these many years later, whether writing about some of your, experiences with your mother in your early years changed
Well,
something about the way you
that's
understood
a very good question. I think, again, yes. I think well, writing is a process, and very often when you're writing, you discover how you feel when in the process of writing, which is a strange thing to say in a way, but I think it's something that many writers experience, but they don't really know how they feel until they start writing it down, and then it
Mhm.
works out. So, uh, as you point out, I mean, I think my relation to my mother was sort of, well, very complicated. I adored her when I was a very young child, and I think that obviously meant a great deal. Then in adolescence, it was also when we arrived in the States, we were immigrants, and my desire was to be American. So anything, she had a heavy accent. She didn't speak English very well in the beginning. I didn't want, I there was a kind of shame. And again, I think a lot of immigrant children feel that with their parents, that they can't identify with the parent because they don't want to be like that. They don't want to have an accent. They want to be American. So that was a really bad period with my mother, I would say. And then when my father died, who was quite young, about 10 years after we left Budapest, I I was unfair. I kind of blamed her in some ways, which wasn't right. And over the years, I realized that, I tell a story about her. The last story I tell about her in the book is a rather warm one, and I think you're right. It's when she was already she was a widow, but she then after many years of widowhood, she married again. She was very happy with this man that she met in the last 10 years of her life, another Hungarian, and they came to Paris when I was there with my family, and she had a great time. But then they left, and we were invited to a party at my at a friend of ours who happened to be a professor, but Hungarian. She was originally Hungarian. So we walk in, and a woman grabs me by the arm, a friend, somebody who was a guest, and she says, I know a lot about you. And I said, really? I've never met you. And she says, yeah, because I met your mother. I said, really? So tell me. So she tells me this whole story about how she said she saw this little couple, sweet old couple walking the little steps, and they looked lost. So she asked them if they needed help. And yes, she directed them to their hotel, and they went. And then my mother, who was very typical of her, she invites her for coffee. I mean, she says, you were so nice. So, and then at coffee, she tells her about, the whole family and what we were doing in Paris and this and that. So this woman says to me, so you see, I recognize, and I knew your mother was from Eastern Europe, the way she was walking with her little steps, and she was such a sweet old lady. And I said to myself, sweet? Oh, this is not my
Right.
mother. And, this whole, you realize the way people see, and I even say, you can never tell how your children will see you, even if you gave them birth. I mean, I always thought of my mother as tough, brave, energetic. She was also quite beautiful. But sweet and old, no, those were not the two adjectives that I would use about her. And so yeah, so that's this thing. But that's the last of the little stories that I tell about my mother, and I think it made me feel very good to be able to tell that story, and it came out in the writing of this book.
Mm-hmm. That's interesting, right?
Yeah.
What are the pieces what are you left with that's sweet? Which I think,
Yeah, you realize that your views change, and also the way other people see your people that you love, or is completely different. So it's not for nothing that I'm a professor of French literature. I study Proust quite a bit, and Proust shows us, that it's like a kaleidoscope. You shake it up, and suddenly the view changes, whether it's a person or a place. Your views change with time. That's what his book is about, really, in some ways. So anyway.
so some of your book is as we've been talking about these kinds of personal reckonings, but you're also reckoning with kind of history with a capital H, obviously, since you lived through some very important, I mean, we all live through important times, but you lived through them in a different way than some of us. So I want to talk a little bit about some of that. One of the things that was very interesting to me is you say that you don't really think of yourself as a survivor, as a child survivor of the Holocaust. Can you talk about your relationship to that term?
That's a really good question. Well, I should say, that historically, I've studied this quite a bit also as an academic. Historically, when I was growing up, when I was a child, there was the concept of child survivor of the Holocaust really was not in the public consciousness, because when people talked about Holocaust survivors, it was usually people who had been the term Holocaust survivor meant somebody who had spent time in a concentration camp. And there was a kind of almost sacred aura about people who had returned, who had tattoos on their arm. So that was what a Holocaust survivor was, right? And the notion of generations of Holocaust survivors was not at all used at the time. So the concept of child survivor of the Holocaust really entered into public consciousness only in the 1980s, which is very late. And then you have now a lot of associations were formed, the International Association of Child Survivors of the Holocaust, and so on. So, and in different countries there are different groups, but until then, really, so nobody thought of the children who survived. And, there's a terrible statistic, incidentally, which is that only 11% of people who were children in 1939, at the beginning of the war, only 11% were still alive in 1945. So you have very few, relatively speaking, very few child survivors, in the sense that many, many children were murdered. Those who survived mainly survived in hiding, under false identities, which is a whole other issue, which I write about in the book. I was one of those. I mean, I was lucky that I was able to hide with my parents, so we were together. But this whole concept of, so in a way, I children survived, and how wonderful. But there wasn't any sort of awareness that child survivors were a specific generation. That came about later, and also with the concept of second generation. So people talked about second generation people are those born after the war, who have no personal memory of the war, but of course their parents and so on. And there's been a lot of writing about that. And then I came up with the term 1.5 generation. That is not second generation, not first generation, 1.5 generation, because people like me were alive during the war. I mean, I was very, very young, but my first memory date to when I was 5 in 44. So the 1.5 generation are the child survivors. And now, of course, I think it's a concept that is used a lot, and people try to understand what did it mean for a child to be hiding, to have to take on a different name, to all the different, and to become an orphan sometimes. I mean, which was this worst of all, is that some children became the sole survivors of their family. So all of that began in the late 70s and early 80s.
Right. But even in the book, you talk about how, as you were moving through Europe on your way out, that you and your family were trying to wrap your brains around the idea that you might fall into the category of displaced persons, right? And you write about how that didn't seem quite to fit either. And so there's kind of an interesting piece about like figuring out what of these large categories, how does one relate to them and fit one's own life story into them?
You're so right. Yes, there was that whole question of, should we go to we were in Vienna along with a lot of other refugees. We were by then refugees from communism. This was 1949-50. So we could be considered Holocaust refugees, and we were technically displaced persons. We were persons displaced from our home, and so there were, as you know, there were these DP camps, displaced persons camps. Most of the people in the camps were people who, in fact, were survivors of the Holocaust, whether camp survivors or survivors in hiding, or many children were born there. Those are the second generation, or the second generation includes many children born in DP camps. But my family, because we didn't, in a strange way, it was hard to wrap our mind around the notion that we were displaced persons who were like the people who had suffered that much in the Holocaust. In a strange way, I don't think we felt that we had suffered all that much. I mean, I hate to put it that way, but I mean, compared to somebody who had been to Auschwitz, my family was lucky. Hey, we were in constant danger of being discovered, and if we had been found out, we would have been killed or whatever. But the Jews of Budapest were not deported en masse. Many Jews in Budapest were killed in other ways, but about 100,000 people survived because they were not, it was too late in the war. It was too late to deport them. Whereas from the provinces in Hungary, in a matter of 3 months, Adolf Eichmann managed to deport about 500,000 Jews from the provinces, but they never made it to organize the deportations from Budapest. So the Budapest Jews considered themselves lucky. I mean, as I say, I hate to put it that way, but in a strange way, it was true.
Right. And you talk in your book about history. A couple times you say you think of history as a form of luck. Can you say what you mean by that?
Well, I think exactly. I say that in that context, it's not by choice. That is to say, we can't take credit for the fact that we survived in a way but yes, in some ways, yes, we had false papers. My father managed to get these false papers. They got a job in Buda, in a tucked away place, et cetera, et cetera. So you could say, yes, it was because we were clever, but that would not be true, because there were clever people who were murdered anyway. So and your choices, I mean, the scholars have talked about the notion of choiceless choice.
Mm-hmm.
That is, you had choices, but they were all bad in a way, or they could all be good, but you only knew that it had been a good choice afterward because you survived. But if you made the choice and it turned out that it was a bad choice, it means that it didn't end so happily. So that's why by talking about luck implies chance, right? I mean, like, in other words, that you can't foresee how things will turn out. You make a choice, you make an existential, you make a leap or whatever, except these are not free choices. These are choiceless choices. You have to make a choice, left or right or whatever. And then you only discover later, oh yeah, it was the right choice. But that was by chance. You see what I mean? So that's why I refer to, I say history is in some ways a form of luck. You know, yeah.
Yeah. I want to shift gears a little bit. I have known of your work for a long time. I've been familiar with your work. So I was very surprised upon reading your book to learn that you were originally oriented towards the sciences and in fact majored in chemistry at Barnard. So tell us about the shift to discovering literature and what it meant to you, and maybe why French literature specifically.
Yeah, that's quite a story. When I came to Barnard, I was 17 years old, and I still remembered my beloved middle school science teacher, who was the wonderful woman. I write about her in the book. But in high school, throughout high school, I was always very good in journal. I was on the paper and all that, but I also kept my interest in chemistry. And so I arrived at Barnard and I said, I'm going to be a chemistry major. And I studied chemistry, and math and calculus and physics. But the truth was, I didn't love it. I didn't. I don't know why. I never understood exactly why I went on for so long with this and so far, even though I didn't love it. What I loved was the few courses I was taking for the first few years in literature. And then in my junior year, I had this sort of I think you could only call it a conversion experience or an illumination or something. And I realized, no, I don't want to be a chemistry major. I want to, and the if I could say the guide through this was not even a French writer. It was Thomas Mann.
Mm.
It was when I discovered the novels of Thomas Mann, who I think we had read something by him in my freshman English class. But then I read The Magic Mountain, and that just blew me away.
Mm.
And Thomas Mann, I mean, he was everything that one could imagine as a great European writer, and thinker. He had ideas. It was absolutely magnificent. And so that kind of it was that it was Thomas Mann who led me to this conversion experience. And so for the last year and a half of college, I did nothing but study literature. But then I did return. Of course, there was Sartre and Camus and Simone de Beauvoir. I mean, French literature in the around 1960 was, of course, a great. As you know, all these names were, existentialism. All these names were so exciting, and uh, and so I never regretted that I studied that I became a professor of French literature. Oh,
And you remarked that it was sort of an interesting, you sort of reflect on how it was an interesting choice given your quest to become American, right? That in the end to choose to study a foreign literature was an interesting choice in that regard.
right. I mean, in a way, it had to do with this unforgetting business too. I had closed the door on Budapest. I at that point in 1960, this was like barely, not even a dozen years after we left. I had no interest whatsoever in returning to Budapest. But what did I do after college? Thanks to my good uncle and to Barnard, which gave me a little scholarship, I went to France. I mean, I went to Paris. So Paris was kind of and we had stopped in Paris on our way out of Europe, and I fell in love with the city. But I went there now as an American and college graduate. So it was very different from the experience of a refugee. I knew that I could go back and forth, and this notion of the round trip ticket, it becomes really very important. But going back to Paris was a way of going back to Europe. It was, I wasn't quite ready yet to go back to Budapest, and it took another 25 years, actually. It was only in the 80s. But I kind of was making my way back to Europe. And you're right. And if I had been so intent on becoming American, then I would probably have studied American literature or even English literature, but no, I studied French literature. I wanted to, so going to France after college and then becoming a French literature professor was my sort of a, a possible way of reclaiming a kind of European identity, which I had been so anxious to get rid of when I first got here.
But then on your own terms, right? So
Yes. Well, yeah, thanks to my American passport, it became a completely different experience. Yeah.
So you became a scholar before second wave feminism brought gender analysis to the academy, but it then did become a big piece of your work as well. How and when did you discover feminism, and how did it shape? This is a big question. How did it shape your life and career? Tell us a little thread of that story.
In 2 words or less.
Right, exactly.
Well, actually, it was in the mid 70s. I had already been teaching at Columbia College. As I tell in the sort of afterward about my later career, I was the first woman professor, or not even professor, instructor, full-time instructor hired at Columbia College. But I had been there for a few years, and that's when American feminism really got going. The first conferences. I remember I remember it very well. It was at Barnard. There was the annual. It became the first annual, I think, Barnard Feminism Conference. Catherine McKinnon was there, and Nancy Miller among the organizers, and I was asked to give a paper, and at that time, I was also very much of a structuralist, like French structuralism was very, very strong. And I realized that in order for me to talk about the French writer that I wanted to talk about, whose name was Robbe-Grillet, he was a big, very big deal, the new novel, but very formalistic and so on. And I realized I wanted to talk about what he writes about, not just about the structures of his book, but about what he writes about. And in fact, he wrote a lot about women and about torturing women and fantasies of sadism involving women. So then I began to read Freud. And for many feminists, Freud is a kind of a no-no word. But I was totally fascinated by Freud because Freud also allows you to sort of, and many feminists, in fact, were fascinated by Freud. He allows you to, again, to sort of go into the content of your psyche, to talk about things like relations to the mother. I mean, so that's why that first paper that I gave, everything came together. Freud, the notion that you talked about literature, but not only in formal terms, that you also had to talk about what literature was writing about, the content, which that is how I sort of entered into feminist analysis. And that was the beginning, and it went on for quite a while. I mean, it was, I would say feminism was what allowed me in a way to really think seriously about questions of identity, which then eventually led to issues about history and memory. you know, so feminism was extremely important as a as a discovery and as one stage in my sort of intellectual development, I guess, or autobiography or whatever.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, right. It's certainly, you see it in what you studied, but also just in the fact that you were able to have the career that you had probably wouldn't have been possible in the same way without feminism as a kind of movement to make, to have that
Well, it's
space
true.
for.
Yeah, when I went to Harvard in 1981 as an associate professor, I was above all actually sort of thought of in their mind as bringing kind of the new French theories to Harvard, because Harvard, as very often happens, Harvard wanted to. It was a little suspicious at first about so-called the new French theories. So Yale was ahead of us, but now we had to. Now Harvard wanted to catch up. So I did a lot of stuff on structuralism and so on, but also feminism. I mean, that was the other big thing in the 80s, and I had wonderful colleagues at Harvard who were also involved in feminist thinking, Alice Jardine and Naomi Shore and Christy McDonald. And it was a wonderful moment for I think for women academics, because we all felt that we were doing something truly pioneering. We were, and then came a moment when we sort of said, well, we've done this. Now, what else are we interested in? So that many of us turned to history, and many of us turned to the study of World War II and the Holocaust, and so it's a process. Yeah.
Right. Well, and in some ways, it maybe feminism was part of what allowed you not only to study those things in, to turn your attention to them and bring your own personal story to them as well, because that's part of what feminism has allowed us to do, is for scholars to be able to, use the I in their work.
That's right. In fact, we always joke that it was those of us who were brought up on either on structuralism, which was a scientific, very formalistic way of studying literature, obviously. But even before then, new criticism, you weren't supposed to say I, because because we don't talk about the author and what the author intended or anything like that. We talk about what are the metaphors, what what do we see here, which are the different ways in which this narrative is organized, and so on. So then suddenly feminism comes along and says, hey, there's a body there. There's a body which is different from other bodies. Because today we have so many different bodies. In those days, we were just interested in the fact that women had been ignored and overlooked and in a way understudied for so long. So we were interested in women. Now, today,
We're deconstructing that.
there are many different genders.
So, I'm thinking about we were talking about your scholarly work and this book, and I'm curious how memoir writing is different or similar to the other kinds of books you've written. Like, do you use any of the same approaches? Does it feel like it's of a piece? Talk a little bit about that.
Well, I mean, the obvious thing is it has no footnotes, which is really extraordinary. So when you're writing a memoir, okay, you need little props. My props were the family photographs. I included quite a few family photographs in the book because they really helped me. They really helped me to sometimes just to even get launched on the writing. You look at a photo and a photo tells a story in some ways or asks to be interpreted. Who are these people? And even a photo of yourself. When was this photo? Who is this girl there? Is that me? I know it's me. It has to be me because I know it's me, but is she really me? Or is she like somebody else, like a little stranger, a familiar stranger? So the photos really prompt an enormous amount of they can prompt writing and thinking and reflecting. So aside from that, you don't need anything else. Whereas when you're writing an academic book or a scholarly book, you have tons and tons of notes, right? I mean, like whenever I was writing my academic books, I would travel with, literally crates full of file folders, that if I went somewhere for the summer or whatever, a crate full of file folders with all the different notes, because this is the chapter that I'm working on. But then, so it's a completely different way of writing, really, in that you're much more, you're much more focused on the actual words on the page, as it were, and what's coming out, and it just has to come out of you. You don't have to look through all your notes because there aren't any notes. At least in my case, there are no notes. There are photos, yes, but there are no notes.
So speaking of photos, I want to show one more that you include in the book. Tell us a little bit about this photo and why you used it, what you took from it.
Well, speaking of familiar strangers, okay, this girl, it was Sue Rubin of Senn High School in Chicago. This was taken in 1956 when I was 16 years old at the time. And it was my high school yearbook photo. And as you can sort of see, I mean, I had worked very hard in becoming an American teenager. I mean, there I was with my hair, my little bangs, and my little thing that we wore, the little whatever, what did we call? I don't even know what we called that thing. A little hair.
Headband? Is it a headband?
Yeah, a headband, but it was like a little metal headband that sort of stuck on you. And so here it is. This is from the chapter called 17, which is about my using 17 magazine as my little Bible for how to become an American teenager. And my high school years became the years when I felt most the biggest drive to belong, to belong to this American body, to this American institution, the high school, and I was going to say maybe I was the most alienated from myself in high school, but not necessarily. I mean, I never called myself Sue again, I have to say, uh, but uh, but I guess it was again just part of a process. And the interesting thing for me about this photo is that after this high school photo was taken, I applied to Barnard College, which was in the East. So if I really wanted to be like, this good Midwestern American girl, I would have stayed in Chicago, which a lot of my classmates did, of course. There are wonderful universities in Chicago or near Chicago. Uh, and no, I decided and my parents were very helpful in that way. They said, well, you should go to the very best school you probably possibly can. But I didn't want to. I didn't apply to any school in Chicago. So, uh, so, so again, the minute I became the perfect teenager, I wanted out. I, I realized, I think somewhere deep down that was not what I totally was or wanted to be.
Right, which of course is a personal story, but also reflects something about the shift from the 50s to the 60s, right? From when you graduated college and went to Paris, and it was another time. I think you were not alone in making that shift of leaving that 50s girl with her little collar behind.
The little collar, yeah, exactly, exactly. Yeah, very good point.
And there's another picture that you have in the book, which I don't have here to show you, but I feel like is the companion one, which is your photo from Paris, which is much more dark and kind of sultry, and you're not really smiling, and it captures you in a slightly different moment.
Right. Well, I think I can find it. It's here somewhere. Let's see. Oh yeah. Yes, this is the last photo in the book. Oh well. It's yes. And well, also here. No, here it is. Yes, I look rather sad in that photo. But you're saying sultry, yeah. Uh, 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 and much more European by then. I think this was taken, I don't know, in 61 after I had been in Paris for a while. But I think also, in the book, I mentioned it was after my father had died. I mean, there was a period of mourning. I think I was still, in a way, I was quite sad at the time. Yeah.
Well,
But yes, very different from that girl, from that healthy teenager. Yeah.
Right. But and I think we've all had that experience of looking at pictures and both recognizing yourself and not recognizing yourself, right? And that interesting question about that continuity of the self.
Absolutely. Absolutely. It is you, but it's also not you. Which again, Proust very definitely would have something to say about that.
For sure.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Susan, for sharing your story with us for tonight, and for kicking us off our new fall book talk series with such a wonderful conversation. I again really love the way you talked about that continuity of the self, even as you go through so many changes, and that paradox of feeling like the same person even as you're changing. And I think that actually, I was thinking about that because it feels like a very relevant theme as we enter a new year with its possibilities of change, even as we also are always bringing ourselves into the future. So thank you for being with us tonight. And thanks to all of you.
Thank you. Thank you for your wonderful question, Judith. It was really fun talking with you. I enjoyed it very much.
Thank you. And I want to share with everyone that there's always more to discover at JWA. Actually, in our encyclopedia, you can read an essay by Susan on the feminist writer and thinker Hélène Cixous. We just released our book list today, which of course includes Susan's book, as well as others that are featured in our book talks and many more. There's 30 books on the list. You can find the list at JWA or the link in the chat. Also want to let you know that the fall season of our podcast, Can We Talk, will kick off on Tuesday with an episode on reconsidering Golda Meir. So look for that on our site or wherever you get your podcasts. And I hope you'll join us for our next book talk, which is in 2 weeks from tonight, Thursday, September 21st. It will be a conversation with Elizabeth Graver about her novel Kantika, which traces several generations of a Sephardic family from Istanbul to Barcelona to Havana and to New York. So again, another story of immigration, but from a fictional and a different perspective. So I hope to see you all there then. And until then, wishing everybody a Chag Sameach, a Shana Tova. May it be a very sweet and healthy new year for all of us and a good year for the world. And good night, everybody. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye.